Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Est. I'm the International Affairs Editor at The Conversation here in the UK. Many thanks for joining us for the latest in our series of webinars in which we engage with academic experts to talk about the pressing issues of the day. And today, unsurprisingly, we're talking about Ukraine. 2.5 weeks ago, at 3 a.m. on Thursday, February the 24th, Russian tanks and armour crossed into neighbouring Ukraine. The invasion followed months of troop build-up, culminating in weeks of desperate diplomacy in an attempt to persuade the Russian President Vladimir Putin that conflict with Ukraine would be a disaster. Their pleas were in vain. And as we know now, a disaster it certainly turned out to be. But it's not all gone altogether as might have been expected. If Putin was hoping the might of his military machine would roll over Ukraine's considerably smaller forces, he was clearly mistaken. Ukraine has been at war effectively now, at least for about 8 years, in the Donbass, and their soldiers are now defending their homes and families. 2.5 weeks into the war, Russia is marred in murderous siege warfare, and the butcher's bill is mounting on both sides. Meanwhile, the risk of escalation remains critical, especially after the prospect of Russia using chemical or biological weapons was raised last week. And bombing and missile strikes have moved ever closer to the border of Poland, a NATO country. It's a hydra-headed story with many aspects, whether political, military, or in terms of its impact on the global economy, especially when it comes to the oil and gas trade. And something becoming increasingly apparent, the invasion has caused one of the worst humanitarian crises since the Second World War, as millions of Ukrainian refugees flee their country in search of a safe haven. To consider these important issues, we have 4 outstanding scholars. From University College London, we have Dr. Aglaya Snetkov, an expert in Russian foreign policy and international security. From the University of Reading, Dr. Alexander Mihailov, an economist whose specialty is international macroeconomics and finance. Coming to us from Tufts University in Massachusetts, Professor Oxana Shevel, whose research includes studying post-Soviet migration and citizenship and has a focus on the challenges to democratization in post-Soviet Eastern Europe. And from the University of Birmingham, Professor Stefan Wolff, an expert in international security and a regular contributor to The Conversation. He's written several outstanding pieces for us in recent weeks in the run-up to the invasion and since the war began, including one just this morning. So I want to begin by asking each of you the same question. Just how dangerous is this crisis as it stands now? We saw Putin raise Russia's nuclear deterrent on high alert. We've heard talk of chemical and even biological weapons. And we know that Russia have a history of using them elsewhere. Putin's now saying that Russia can and will target arms deliveries coming to Ukraine from the West. This just seems to get more and more perilous, doesn't it? What do you think, Aglaya?
Thank you very much for having me on. This is obviously, one of the biggest crises in Europe since World War II. And it is a perilous crisis when it comes to the situation on the ground in Ukraine, as evident by the urban bombing, the disastrous humanitarian situation. It has also become already a disastrous situation by essentially causing one of the biggest migration crises in Europe. So it is dangerous both on the ground in Ukraine, but also more broadly. We also don't know the ramification this will have in terms of questions of global governance, in terms of, for example, international global economy, questions of food, migration, etc. So the ramification of this on the ground are already disastrous, but we don't even know what the fallout, the wider fallout from this crisis is going to be. From the point of view of the West, they have seemed to have tried to, on the one hand, localize this as a security crisis as much as possible by talking about this, stopping the contagion, security contagion on the ground in Ukraine. And for example, President Biden talking about creating red lines and ensuring this does not turn into World War III. But on the other hand, for example, from the West perspective, they have also been trying to globalize this as an economic crisis in trying to create sort of extensive global economic pressure onto the Putin regime. So the ramifications are major. And at this stage, we're sort of still watching it unfold as we see in front of us. And we do not know in any way at this point, what the extensive full fallout of this will be going forth.
Thanks, Aglaya. Alex, from your perspective, how dangerous is this now?
First of all, thank you for inviting me on this panel. There's no doubt that this is the highest level of global risk, potentially, of a nuclear third and last war that I have ever lived through my generation, my lifetime. It is absolutely crucial, I think, and urgent that a way to ceasefire and negotiations is found. And I think the major tools here are international diplomacy. Perhaps China can intermediate, plus the economic sanctions, which could be better targeted and become more comprehensive. And I here see a leading role by the European Union because they are mostly dependent on imports from Russia, as well as they provide a lot of exports to Russia on the economic side of the story. Any further escalation leading to a potential direct involvement of NATO poses a huge risk of irreparable disaster for humanity and needs to be avoided. Russia's own capacity to recognize where it is going, I think, is crucial, and immediately change course of action. That may be perhaps the most realistic hope to negotiations now rather than delaying them. That's what I think on the first question.
Thanks, Alex. Turning to you, Oksana. What's your perspective on this? How dangerous is this, do you think?
Thank you for inviting me to participate. I agree with the previous speaker said. I think the situation is very dangerous, even if some misguidedly might think that it somehow can be contained in Ukraine, given what's happening in Ukraine, a humanitarian crisis of major proportion. And at this point, the Russian forces have only begun to enter the territory of Ukraine. I mean, there are 26 regions in Ukraine. Only one has been seized so far, and a few others laid siege to, and we already have millions of refugees, major humanitarian disaster, and it can only get worse. Now, this sort of instability in the heart of Europe that's already producing massive refugee flights may affect global food security, may affect nuclear safety, right, given what's happening around Ukraine's nuclear power plants. And then, of course, there are broader global implications. I would even go sort of as far as saying that I think the whole international global order is in crisis because we essentially have a state that was supposed to guarantee global security, a member of UN Security Council that has essentially gone rogue. How to deal with that is something completely unprecedented. It seems like there is no way within the international institutions that we have, within the global structures that we have to address that. So definitely, I think the dangers are very real. I don't think, again, that somehow this can be sort of, can go back to normal. I think I don't see any other way to longer term stability unless Russia is defeated in this quest. So unless, something either on the battlefield or something happens domestically, any kind of accommodation with the hope of going back to normal with the kinds of regime that Putin created and leads in Moscow, I just don't see that as a permanent solution that would bring back stability on the continent and globally.
Thanks, Oksana. Turning to you, Stefan. I mean, you and I have been working on the Ukraine really since 2014. When the annexation of Crimea and the start of the conflict in the Donbass. From your perspective, what is this? What's happening? How bad are things now?
Well, there's very little that I can add to sort of being the last speaker here for the moment in a very distinguished lineup. I think my perspective on this is that all of what my colleagues have said is absolutely true. And I think it's further exacerbated by the fact that in Vladimir Putin, we are not dealing with a man who is a model of either restraint or rationality. So I think at this stage, it simply is impossible, from my perspective, to predict what will happen. So as the old adage goes, you have to plan for the worst while hoping for the best.
Thanks. I'm going to stay with you actually on this. We've actually received quite a lot. I want to return to quite a few of the points you've all made, but just first to Stefan, we've received quite a lot of questions from our readers, and here's one from Chris, and I'm paraphrasing here. But since early on in this conflict, Ukraine has been calling on NATO increasingly desperately to enforce a no-fly zone over its territory. NATO, till now anyway, has been unanimous in ruling this out. and remains so. By doing so, and by doing so early on in the conflict, did it narrow its options? And look, do you think this will change? What would it take to change? Are there red lines? What more can NATO do?
Well, I think at the moment what NATO is doing is sort of pursue what I would call a policy of proactive containment. And that sort of really involves several actions that we are seeing unfolding at the moment. So on the one hand, there is, of course, the whole package of sanctions that are being applied against Russia, really in an effort to maximize the particularly economic pressure on Russia. And I think that is very important. At the same time, NATO has continued to supply Ukraine with essential military equipment, and I think that will also remain an essential component of this strategy, simply to enable the Ukrainian military to continue with its so far quite successful resistance against the Russian aggression. And I think the third element in this strategy is to really be very clear that NATO will not directly become involved in the fighting in Ukraine, but that Article 5 of the NATO treaty, the collective defense clause, is and will remain operational. And I think this is sort of, in a way, paraphrasing what Aglaya said in the beginning, this sort of dual strategy of localizing the conflict as a security issue and globalizing it as a sort of as an economic and diplomatic issue, because I think that in the end will hopefully create a situation in which it will be possible to return to quite serious negotiations directly between Ukraine and Russia, in order to make sure that there is this faint off-ramp that people keep talking about, which would actually allow both sides a kind of saving extra from this situation at the moment.
Yeah, it does remain a hair trigger, doesn't it? I mean, for example, just
for Christ, and that's described by Pericles in the history of the Peloponnesian War. And they have been used by the Romans in the Middle Ages. Nowadays, they are considered part of the instruments of diplomacy and trade policy. And I'm going to cite scholar here, David Baldwin, and his Economic Statement 1985 book, where he says, neither war nor economics can be divorced from politics. Each must be judged as an instrument serving the higher goals of the polity. And then he continues that sanctions are techniques that enable policy makers to demonstrate firmness, that's very important, demonstrate firmness while reassuring others of their sense of proportion and restraint, especially when there is a nuclear danger. And a final point, economic sanctions can be more effective than propaganda or diplomacy because they are more costly and thus are inherently more credible. And again, an obvious link to economic theory and game theory here is that you have to guess the best strategy of your opponent and to suggest credible threats in this kind of game. There was a review article on the effects of sanctions long ago in the Journal of Economic Perspective 2003, but the title is very interesting, Sanctions, Neither War Nor Peace. It's an article by Lance Davis and Stanley Engerman. The sanctions that are most likely to have the greatest impact are various restrictions on international trade, financial flows, and movement of people. The Peterson Institute for International Economics lists hundreds of economic sanctions by year, principle, sender, target country, policy goal, success score on a scale from 0 to 16, and cost to target country in terms of percent of GNP. Many times in the past, either the USSR or Russia have been either a sender or a target of these sanctions, with the other side being US, UK, the European Union more recently. Most of the literature I'm aware of doesn't describe sanctions and very effective. They are kind of a blunt instrument. For example, it took about 30 years to bring down the regime of Omar al-Bashir in Sudan. But I think there are 4 important characteristics that make sanctions possibly effective. They have to be surprising, number 1. They have to be comprehensive, with no exceptions, number 2. Number 3, they should and could be strategically targeted. And finally, they should stay for long. None seems to be true, however, in the present case with Russia. And so there is scope that these sanctions are ratcheted up. For example, not excluding Russian banks from the SWIFT system because the West has to pay for their gas and oil imports. I read today on Twitter a famous economist, Olivier Blanchard, who mentioned that, for example, Europe can be more strategic in targeting their exports to Russia. They can disrupt the production chain of Russia by targeting special exports from Europe to Russia that are important ingredients in the technological production process for Russia. So then there is this other discussion again today, fellow economists on Twitter. We kindly agree that it's time to act seriously and to stop importing from Russia, because then this freeze of central bank assets is just partial, because there are millions and perhaps billions of euros that Russia is gaining every single day because of the pipelines of exports of gas and oil. So these costs are going to be painful to our society. Germany is most dependent. There is a paper today, Econ Tribute Policy Brief, 7th of March, Rudi Bachmann and other German colleagues, some of them working abroad. So they have calculated that 55% of the gas, 34% of oil imports, and 26% of coal for Germany come from Russia. So it will be most painful for Germany, but we all agree that such pain is comparable to the pandemic. In fact, the German colleagues calculated that in a best scenario, German GDP in this year will lose 0.5%, and in a worst case scenario that would go to 3%. And to compare with the first year of the pandemic 2 years ago, German GDP lost 4.5%. So I'm seeing a consensus of my fellow economists converging to tightening of the sanctions, and this is in a way to avoid this other potential of escalating the conflict and involving NATO in some way or another, because maybe Russia is trying to provoke that. I'm wrong to say Russia. I want to say Kremlin or Putin's regime or Kremlin's policy. I think we are far from blaming Russians. Russians are usual, normal people, and they have condemned what Putin has done to their country and their reputation. And there is a letter that became publicized by Yanis Varoufakis recently, a manifesto of Russian socialists and communists, where they basically say this is an invasion, no threat to the Russian state exists, and concludes our enemies are not in Kiev and Odessa, but in Moscow. It is time to kick them out. War is not Russia. War is Putin and his regime.
Thanks for that. I mean, I was reading today that Germany's energy minister has said that sanctions would, stopping buying oil and gas from Russia would hurt Germany more than it would hurt Russia, and that let alone power cuts, they're talking about complete power outages, power stops, kind of thing. So I mean, is there a sense in which this is down to the will of the German people? I mean, are they likely? You say we need these things to be comprehensive. Could Germany be a weak link in this? Alex?
I think that there is a growing consensus that what has been done so far is not sufficient. At least my academic colleagues in Germany are very active in the recent days with their research, with their calculations. As I mentioned, these numbers, they are serious numbers made by serious researchers, a number of them, and they're trying to communicate this message to German politicians. Of course, Germany is a democratic country. There are ways to introduce this decision further on. And again, I think Germany only is not sufficient. That has to be followed up by Italy, Netherlands, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, the big powers. But this is the alternative. Economic sanctions could replace the risk of something that we don't want to think about.
Thanks, Alex. Can I turn to you, Aglaya? And still on sanctions, but Sammy, who sent us in a question, wants to know how much of a toll are these sanctions beginning to take on ordinary Russians? What are you hearing?
So at this stage, I think what we can see is that the Russian economists and the Russian regime are basically trying to come up with a management strategy. A number of different policies have been put in place. There's been an assumption of sort of, interest rate hikes, potential renationalization of Western businesses that have sort of departed in order to essentially manage the unemployment problem. There's talks of unemployment going up to 3 million, inflation, loss of GDP, etc. So that's on a macroeconomic level. And at the same time, there's been talk domestically that at the moment, does a central bank, do the Russian economies actually have the necessary sort of strategies for managing such an unprecedented crisis? Because the turn of events has been frankly unprecedented. The fallout will be everywhere. And it's not just a question of, for example, the Russian consumer, but it's also, for example, in terms of Russian industries, jobs. The fallout from this will be felt in every sector of the Russian economy. At the moment, it is, I think we're still waiting to see the actual effect on the sort of the Russian public, the perceptions in Russia. Sort of from a sociological point of view, a lot of the attention has been placed on trying to analyze how the Russian public is sort of viewing the so-called special operation, the Russian war in Ukraine. And a lot of focus has been placed on that. The fallout from the sanctions, obviously, it's still only being felt sort of in the last few days, because although the war has been going on for a while, obviously the effect in terms of let's say, the Russian consumer is only being felt more recently as the businesses have departed. My impression from sort of talking to friends and family and also sort of trying to, watch clips on YouTube, etc., is that there's lots of mixed responses. But at the moment, I think people on the whole are still waiting to see. And there's a lot of expressions such as, we've survived sanctions before, this is going to be no different from 2014. Fine, we'll go back to Soviet Union, but we managed fine. Mostly from people, interestingly, who weren't alive or were not around in Soviet times. And as the person who was, these are not people who remember, let's say, the rationing cards that I remember in the late 80s. So whilst, Soviets did survive, I'm not sure it was such a great life. Some people are talking about how this will be a disaster, but there's mixed feelings in terms of how long the sanctions will, for example, last. Some people talk about a month, some people talk about a year, some people talk about until the regime changes. So the picture is still very mixed. I'm almost feeling like there's a sense of sort of being in the eye of the storm and the stillness before the fallout. And we will see over the next sort of 3 to 6 months what effect this actually has. The Russians have managed to deal with the sanctions after 2014 in a reasonably okay way. It was not felt as such a disastrous implications on the ground in Russia. But everyone else calculates and economists do that this is completely unprecedented. Up until now, Russia has been totally integrated into the global economy. And so when people are talking about this going back to the Soviet Union, this is nothing like Soviet Union, because, the extent of globalization, the sort of production links, the sort of just chains of supply are completely different. And so we have never actually had a situation, as far as I know, but Alex will know more about this, that, economy has literally been sort of ripped out of the global economy as quickly, almost overnight. We don't know what the effect of that will be. And at the moment, I don't think the Russian public do. And so this is something we are going to have to sort of watch to manage and to feel the public opinion, whether there will be a revolt against the regime, whether or not there will be the sort of a sense of rallying around the regime anti-West and saying, well, they've always hate us, look what they've done to us, right? So I think at the moment everyone is sort of waiting and seeing. this is definitely a story that we will have to keep on watching over the next few months as it sort of unfolds and what it kind of means in practice.
I just want to take you back to one thing you just said, and it's interesting you're saying that because I've sort of understood that it's kind of more older Russians who sort of hankering after past glories of the Soviet Union that support Putin, his main support base. But he seems to have significant support among young people as well. Is that the case?
So my impression, and again, this is with the unprecedented, this is undoubtedly an unprecedented crisis for Ukraine, but it has also been a major change for Russia. And, the legislation, again, sort of talking about the war, etc., that have been brought over in the last 2 weeks have meant that actually discussing such issues has become much more problematic. And so I think the majority, so people have talked in terms of sort of the quarters. The quarter support was going on, the quarter sort of against it, the quarter have disengaged, and the quarter sort of don't know. On the whole, people have talked about the fact that, the older generation are sort of more in favor and the young people are more against. But again, this is quite mixed. And we have had plenty of kind of young Russians coming out in support of the Russia's war in Ukraine. I think what I found interesting in terms of sort of the public perception is there are a few themes and tropes that seem to reverberate regardless of the generational divide and almost regardless of whether people support the regime or not. One of them, for example, being the question of the information war. And I heard this all across, sort of that sense of everyone is playing an information war. We don't know what's going on. This will be worked out kind of later. And this seems to be said by those who support the regime and don't support the regime. There's also been major sort of complete disengagement with what's going on, if that's even possible. I mean, the Russian public has been apoliticized, depoliticized for absolutely years. I'm not sure it's ever become politicized after the Soviet Union. And there has been absolutely a withdrawal, sort of moving it back into the sort of the kitchens and not talking about it. And again, that's true for those who support the regime and those who don't support the regime. That sense of like, well, I'm a civilian, the politicians do what they do, I don't get involved, again, cuts across everyone. There is also, I think, that sense of sort of rallying in support of our own is also something I've heard, again, both from the elderly and the young people. The difference is that the elderly, the generation sort of mine and above, so let's say 40 and above, or maybe even 50 and above, are probably those who are still more likely to be the generation that switch on the TV and sort of let it run, whereas the young people are sort of the Instagram generation who are much more keen on actually actively finding stuff out. And perhaps do follow sort of the right Telegram channels and are able to actually see the images coming out of Ukraine, unlike, for example, their parents. And so there is, in some ways, generational breakdowns, but there is also, in some ways, general disengagement from what is going on. That cuts across all, I would say, generations and sectors of Russian society at the moment. But something to keep in mind is it's also incredible. This is where we're going back a little bit to Soviet Union, which is that feeling that actually understanding Russian society from afar is incredibly difficult because a lot of people are very afraid. From talking to my family who are there to being able to just, pick up a phone and talk to somebody. And so we know less and less about what's going on in Russia, which is actually quite dangerous because to be able to feel what's going on is therefore becomes more problematic from far away.
That's a very important point, isn't it? Where people are getting their information from, and yeah, that generational divide is important too. Turning to you, Oksana. Here in the UK, the government's announced a scheme to help households here take in Ukrainians fleeing the violence. But, the brunt of this is obviously going to be borne by countries neighboring Ukraine. Poland, for example, has, well, last I looked at the numbers, it was more than 1.5 million people that have crossed the border looking for safety, and they expect more daily. What can the rest of the world be doing to help countries like Poland and Romania? And the other point is, after Syria, when, hundreds of thousands of refugees flooded through into Europe, and now Ukraine, is there a sense that Putin is weaponizing refugees and migrant flows?
Right. Well, several things I'll mention with regard to refugees flows to Europe. One, I think it's obviously fantastic that Ukrainian refugees are receiving so far a welcome reception in most countries. I mean, UK is here is a little different with the more complicated entry requirements and so forth. But in other countries, refugees are allowed to work. They're welcomed. That's, of course, is a big difference from how refugees from the wars in the Middle East, the reception that they received early. I think, when maybe the dust settles and sort of there is a reckoning with the consequences of this conflict, this kind of, almost sort of racial dimension to the refugee response in Europe will be probably something that will be discussed and analyzed. In the sort of shorter term for Ukrainian refugees specifically, I think your point about Putin potentially weaponizing refugee crisis is important. I think that's the primary goal. This sort of Ukrainian humanitarian catastrophe create. I think primary goal of this army, they Russian army is not doing nearly as well as it hoped or. Hello.
Yeah, hello, hi, Oksana. I think we've lost you. Have we? Can you hear me? I tell you what, I'll leave for a second. I'll come back to you. Alex, let me come to you. From the point of view of an economist, this makes no sense, does it? I mean, the cost of funding an invasion, the risk of crippling Russia's economy with sanctions and further to disrupt Russia's key oil and gas trades, the risk of being shut out of global markets and banking for the foreseeable future. And you obviously think that should be for a significant period of time. Putin and his advisors must have gamed this, surely. What are they thinking?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, it makes no sense. Within a healthy and rational logic, this doesn't make a sense. But we mentioned here that we are not perhaps dealing with a rational regime, and so that's the danger of it. That's the unprecedented case that we have now. Well, economics and politics that are involved usually in such calculations are about how much pain or cost a nation or an alliance of nations is prepared to suffer from, and what will be the financial consequences to bear, how much. And there is no easy answer. In a war, both opposing camps lose. Short of war, under economic sanctions, most likely too, but less. So it's a matter of, we economists often analyze, that's our basic method, the relative costs and benefits, and so that could be a trigger of certain actions and strategies. One clear message from very basic economic theory is that market democracies and free international trade mean cheaper life for all of us, consumers globally. Relative to trade restrictions, sanctions, not to say anything about wars that disrupt supply and demand for long periods of time and have destructions. Another even deeper insight from the history of the past century is that property rights and markets are the root of Western prosperity. While the utopia of central planning or command economy under state ownership, replacing markets failed miserably, and we have seen that in the late 80s and early 90s everywhere in Eastern Europe. Finally, we mentioned the divides here, young versus old generation, with Putin, against Putin. The situation is complex. Historically, it's complex. The Russian nation is composed of different political colors. So I have the feeling, nevertheless, also based on some of my recent research, that generally in Eastern Europe and in Russia, there is still this divide between the old generation and modern generation, say the last people who are now 25, 30. I do not think this young generation has anything to do with Stalinist methods or would support such dogmatic regime and dictatorship. So we are now living in 2022. As Aglaya mentioned, that is the Instagram generation. We have internet, we have information. The problem here is that we don't distinguish fake from real information. And we mentioned this wars, informational wars. But my view is that the young generation, as well as the majority of the older generations in Russia ultimately will not tolerate lies, will not tolerate destruction. When you watch on TV how families are separated, a mom and a boy who is less than 18 leave for Poland, and the father and the other boy who is above 18 stay there to die, I don't know how we can. It's in arts, we would remember Sophie's Choice, this film by Spielberg long ago. I would have never imagined I would see something in my lifetime after all these democratic changes once again.
Let me come back. We've got you back, Oksana. Let me come back to you. You were talking about the flow of refugees and the notion of weaponizing refugees. Do you want to just recap?
Yes,
on
I just want to follow up on the weaponization. As I said, I don't think that's the primary objective. I think this is sort of like the side effect, for lack of a better word, but it certainly serves Putin's interests, because if this conflict continues, the flows can only increase. If you look at the size of Ukraine, you look where the Russian forces have been now, and if, say, they were to continue this grinding advance by carpet bombing cities and continuing humanitarian crises, we would see many more people leave Ukraine. And that, definitely would put pressure on West European societies. And I think Putin's sort of probably expectation and goal with this would be to create exactly the kind of divisions that might, break this kind of coalition against Putin that has formed pretty rapidly in Europe. I think that was the expectation all along. If we think about calculations and miscalculations on the part of Putin before the war started, I think one of the miscalculations was exactly about the West. I mean, there were obviously big miscalculations about Ukraine as well. But as far as the West, that it is weak, it is divided, that, as Fiona Hill said in one of the recent interviews, that Russian officials believe they can buy, quote unquote, enough, politicians in the West, from the far right to others who received Russian money, right? So this sorts of, weaponization of migration with the goal of weakening the West resolve, potentially put pressure on Ukraine to concede, the terms that Putin favors, and so forth. I think that would be part of the calculation. And I just wanted to, just very quickly chime in on the situation in the Russian society. I don't think this is just Putin's war. I think we should be very clear that substantial part of the Russian society, we can discuss what percent is it? Is it 50? Is it 70? Opinion polls are not fully reliable. But I don't think that's it would be doing justice to the facts on the ground to pretend or hope that the Russian society is somehow duped or unaware or sort of secretly is against the war. Unfortunately, there is very strong support for the war and for the message that we can discuss why that is. With the relentless Russian propaganda that was happening for many years, anti-Ukrainian propaganda specifically, with the decapitation of any political opposition or civic opposition in the Russian society. But unfortunately, it is not just the war of the regime.
Actually, you've come very neatly on to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is something we're going to publish a story about this tomorrow, which is the way it seems that in the Putin era, we've almost seen the end of Glasnost, the clampdown on information, the clampdown on dissent. I've been watching YouTube videos today, horrific things of people. A woman held up a blank sheet of paper with, as a protest, and was dragged off and put in a van. There was actually a video in which a woman was trying to tell an interviewer that she supported the invasion, and was dragged off and put in a van. How secure is Putin, Stefan? Is he politically unassailable? Could he be toppled by the political class or a popular revolution? What is the situation? How secure is he?
Well, I mean, as most people in this panel have said before me, I mean, it's difficult to judge these things from afar. I mean, my own experience growing up in East Germany in the 1970s and 1980s. I mean, these regimes look secure until they don't. So I think that's just a fact of life. And whatever predictions we make now, they may turn out correctly tomorrow, in a week, in a month, in a year. So I really don't think at the moment this is necessarily the point to assume that Putin's regime is going to fall imminently. I would absolutely agree with what Oksana said, that I mean, no matter what percentage of people in Russia are supporting Putin, it's definitely a very, very small minority that is prepared to oppose him directly. I think it's very similar to, sort of from the knowledge that I have, what's going on in his inner circle. I mean, anybody who was watching the live session of the Russian Security Council just before the recognition of the 2 occupied territories in Ukraine could clearly see that there was, I mean, hardly anybody who did not tell Putin what he wanted to hear. So I think from that perspective, there is no reasonable prospect now to assume that suddenly there will be a revolution or a palace coup against Putin. And I think that's also important from a Western strategic perspective. And there was a question about this from the audience, whether we should be doing anything to actually encourage regime change. And here I would say, I mean, historically, our track record in doing that is not exactly great. Certainly not over the past 20 or so years. But also, I think if we are trying to contain the current crisis, I mean, anything that feeds Putin's paranoia or the paranoia of a larger part of Russian society that actually the West is out to get them cannot but be counterproductive. So I think in that sense, really the aim needs to be to do as much as possible to end this conflict as quickly as possible, and then subsequently think about what this actually means for what will have to be some new global and European security order, and how future crises and wars indeed of this nature can be more effectively prevented. So I think regime change really at the moment is neither on the cards nor should it be part of the West's agenda at the moment.
Now, I've got a couple more questions, and we've been getting questions from the audience as we've been going along, so I'm going to take some of them too. I was staying with Putin for a moment, though. We get this picture painted, which obviously is very partial, but of Putin as an increasingly isolated figure who's for 2 years been sheltering from COVID, hasn't been mixing with anyone. I was talking to somebody recently who looked at the way there was a build up to the invasion, but then the Russian military didn't do any of the things it probably should have done first, and it kind of gave the impression that it was a decision taken at haste. Aglaya, does Putin remain a rational actor in all this, briefly?
So, I mean, personally, there's been a lot of discussion as to whether he's a rational actor, and because so much of this sort of the question of what's going on in Ukraine, it sort of settles on him and let's say five of the Siloviki around him. I appreciate why this becomes so important as a debate, but I think the more helpful or useful way of engaging with that, rather than talking about whether he's a madman or not, is to consider it through the prism of logics. So what are the logics that, let's say, Putin and the regime sort of follow? And I think in those ways, we can sort of understand why, one, where they were aiming at, and two, the question is sort of where they're at. So from their perspective, 2014 did not create too much pushback. They survived it. They do see the West as weak. They do think it's disorganized. They did assess that the Ukrainian population did not support Ukraine. They thought it would be a successful, short, or limited war. But they amassed sufficient army that if it didn't, they would sort of manage it. That's, I think, the logic at the beginning. What we don't know is where has the logic moved to in the middle of this conflict, and where is it going to be at the end? At this stage, in terms of, let's say, negotiations that they've had or discussions they've had with Macron or Schultz, they've come out to say that the logics are sort of the same. So what the Putin regime is demanding hasn't changed too much, perhaps except for the denazification discussion and the regime change. But what we don't know is what, in that respect, will make the greater Putin, if you like, or the regime concede to some sort of negotiations. So where is the logic going to be at? Because in practice, and okay, this is sort of coming across as a constructivist, right? Almost anything could be constructed as a victory. right? They could withdraw tomorrow to say, well, we've destroyed all the military installations. Perhaps this is sufficient, right? The question, however, is at which stage is the Putin regime going to see that their logic of war has been satisfied? And because of the opaqueness and the closeness of the regime, at this stage, we don't know. We know that they will be willing to sacrifice enough of their troops. They've done that in other conflicts. We know that they are not going to blink at, high civilian casualties on the ground. We have Syria and we have Chechnya. We don't, however, know whether or not Putin is so stuck with this logic of expecting neutrality, expecting Ukraine to sort of claim that they will never join EU and NATO and expect the territory recognition, that he will never budge from that. And until Zelensky sort of shifts his positions, that's the logic we'll be in. We really don't know. But I don't know if it's all completely sort of helpful to just talk about it in terms of sort of rationality, because we have little access to Putin on the ground to sort of understand where the thinking is at. But that's where we can analyze it from the outside, sort of looking at it as a regime analysis. Thanks.
Now, title of this webinar is What's Next for Ukraine? And actually what Aglaya was just saying kind of leads me very nicely onto that. I want to spend just a little bit of time focusing on this before we go to audience questions. But Stefan, how does this end? What Aglaya was saying is that Russia will or can claim some kind of victory with the minimum of in a sense, the minimum of gains or concessions. Will the West want to give Putin concessions? Crimea or the separatist republics? Can NATO afford to give ground in the face of naked aggression? What do you think?
Well, I think just to echo what Aglaya just said, I mean, it's really hard to determine from the outside what will be considered sort of a face-saving exit for Russia, but to some extent also for Ukraine and the West. I think what's also really important is that, in my view, it's really far too early how this will end and what concessions might be required. But I think we should also be clear about two things in particular. I mean, first of all, it's really not for the West to determine what concessions Ukraine should be making. I mean, this basically would totally buy into the logic that Putin has, that a country like Ukraine shouldn't have any agency. It really should be down to all the great powers, and in particular to the greatest powers of all, which in Putin's view clearly is Russia, to decide the fate of so-called weaker states within Europe. And I mean, that is a logic that again, I mean, goes back several hundred years. I mean, at least to whatever the 17th, 18th century. And this is really not something to which I think we should return or should be complicit in allowing Putin to return us to that. So that's the first point. And I think the second point also is that right now, I think it's a distraction and sort of a red herring to talk about how this will all end. I don't think that the end is anywhere near in sight. I mean, there's a great quote by Churchill that there's always light at the end of the tunnel, but right now I don't actually think we have dug the tunnel yet to see this light. I think at the moment what is absolutely important is to get a ceasefire in place so that the violence on the ground starts. And if this cannot be achieved as a nationwide ceasefire in direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, then efforts have to be made that at least these so-called humanitarian corridors are beginning to work. I think this is really where the focus needs to be now. And yes, strategically, we need to think about what's coming after. But I think for Ukraine's sake right now, there are more important things that can and need to be done to end what is a massive humanitarian disaster in the first place. So I think this is really where the focus needs to be, rather than thinking probably a year or so ahead how this, whatever this actually is, ends.
Thanks, Stefan. I'm going to start looking at a few questions from the audience. We've got one from Claire who's saying, could European neighbours help Germany to replace energy imports from Russia by sharing their own supplies? Is that feasible? What do you think, Alex?
It's a good question, and I think that Germany is perhaps in the least favorable situation given their dependency ratios, which I cited in terms of percentages, but all Western European nations, as well as the Eastern European nations, such as Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, they're dependent much more than Germany on Russian oil and gas. It's a wake-up call, and it's an urgent wake-up call, and today German economists were discussing that the stop of imports from Russia should be immediate, and no matter the costs, and they can be as high as 3-4% of GDP. We have seen that we can cope with it, but the cost of the war continuing is higher. So my view is that the European allies, the Western allies, will find a way to diversify. When you are not diversified, when you have a high dependency ratio on a particular country in finance or in trade, you depend a lot on them. So it's very tricky, and the current situation shows it very nicely. So what I imagine is that in the next 1, 2, 3 years, the Western countries will help Germany, but also will help each other to source from other countries. There is Norway, a huge oil and gas exporter. There is the Middle East countries. There are other countries, Mexico. So Russia is not the only, although it is a major oil exporter and gas exporter, there are ways to diminish that influence, and I am confident that Europeans will find some solution, including in cooperation with Germany.
Thanks. And just one for Oksana. You wrote recently in an article for Just Security website that Putin's goal is to re-establish Russian political and cultural dominance over Ukraine, a nation that Putin sees at one with Russia, and then follow up by undoing the European rules-based order and security architecture. I mean, this is essentially saying, this doesn't bode well for the Baltic states, Moldova, and the like. Is that where you're concerned for this escalation?
Well, before we even consider other countries, I think it's important to realize, and here I would echo something that Stefan is saying, Ukrainians' agency and their understanding of the situation. From the point of view of Ukrainians, they're fighting for the right to exist as a nation and as people. I mean, this I think is hugely important, because it goes to explaining the absolute mobilization we see in Ukraine, the sacrifice, right, and kind of cutting through the gaslighting, that we see sometimes coming, not only from the Putin regime, but also through some analysis in the West. Putin made it very clear he does not believe Ukraine has a right to exist as a nation, and that Ukrainian people who express any opinion that is in any way different from what Putin believes is right are essentially Nazis. So this is the right to exist. So I think that's very important. As far as, if the conflict might spread further, as I was saying, I think, again, if we look historically, Putin's belief, two kind of beliefs that go hand in hand. One, that the West is really out to get him. If you read the pre-invasion speech that he gave, I mean, the whole thrust of this speech is how essentially the West, led by the US, has been plotting against Russia all along, and Ukraine is essentially kind of a staging ground, right, for these offensives against Russia. So I think that's very important, that it's not some sort of, engagement on the concrete security steps, right? As you place certain missiles there, or you don't place, like how far are they, who conducts the exercises, who can monitor it. It is essentially this belief that ultimately is unfalsifiable, that, the West is out to get Russia, and they are waging a defensive war. So it sort of went as far now that not only they deny that they attacked Ukraine, as, Russian foreign minister did a few days ago, it is presented to the public as a defensive war, right? So that's, I think, also very important to keep in mind here. Yes, I would be somewhat disagreeing with Stefan, that, who was saying that we don't want to kind of feed into Putin's paranoia. I think that paranoia is already there. So I think there is little else that the West can do to kind of increase it, right? And unfortunately, I think also there is quite little what the West can do to decrease it. Would it spread, to other countries? Again, the pattern that, several other panelists already mentioned, that Russia did various aggressive steps against neighboring countries before and got away with it, right? So if Putin can get away now in Ukraine with essentially laying the country to waste, potentially running literally concentration camps in the territories that if they manage to occupy, there is no way any kind of puppet regime without full-scale occupation is sustainable. They would have to have full-scale occupation. We see this, footage from supposedly pro-Russian regions in the south, that we're supposed to welcome Russian troops, where people are mobilizing, in large numbers. Local authorities refuse to cooperate. So there is absolutely no way that some sort of non-occupation type regime can be established. And if occupation is established, first of all, I don't think it's really feasible. They don't really have the capacity. That's why I think ultimately Putin cannot win this war, but he can create a lot of damage. It would have to be massive repression, except that it won't be televised, right? And again, some in the West may say, well, we sort of solved the conflict. So I would, caution against that. And then could it spread potentially further? Yes, it could. I don't think this is something that's in the immediate sort of possibility tomorrow. But again, if the regime, again, is emboldened, it can get away, thinks it can get away with it. I don't think anybody is safe.
I need to we just got time to squeeze one more question from Adrian, and I'm going to direct this to Aglaya. Where's China in all this? Adrian asks, could China be the final victor of the Russian-Ukraine war? And you've got about 1 minute, please.
So China has been trying to play a kind of subtle game of not getting too involved on either side. There's obviously been a lot of discussions today over the US-China sort of high-level meetings, and the discussion whether the Russians have asked the Chinese for the military and the Americans pushing back to ensure the Chinese do not come out in support of Russia. I think the Chinese have been trying to do a middle way because of the Western effort to globalize the economic dynamic. The West has been very much trying to show to China that they can't stay out, that they have to pick one side or the other. And from a Chinese perspective, the West is hoping that the Chinese will pick the West because essentially of the economic dynamic. The Chinese, however, have been very careful to try and make sure they can do the middle ground. And I think they will need to consider which way they can go. To some extent, sees the US as just as much in negative terms as the Putin does. In that, some ways, the regimes are not that different. The Chinese are clearly looking at what's going on in Ukraine to see what the West is potentially going to do with regards to Taiwan. At the beginning, people have talked how part of the signaling the West has done vis-a-vis Russia was actually done towards China to show that, you go against Taiwan, this is what happens. So I don't know whether the Chinese are going to sort of break down all their relations with Russia. At the moment, they're trying to ensure that they're not breaking some of the sanctions. It will be interesting to see whether the West is able to push China off its attempt to sort of carry on with this middle ground. We will have to go and see. I'm not sure. I think this is something we will still have to see what regime decides. But it is definitely an interesting sort of dynamic, because that's where the implications of the Ukraine crisis come for the global community, the international system, et cetera, because this changes a lot of global dynamics beyond simply the absolutely disastrous just the terribleness of the war in Ukraine and the migration crisis in Europe. This is why it has wide ramifications across the international system as well, because it challenges many of those dynamics alongside everything else.
I'm going to have to cut in now. We're running out of time. We've got about a minute left, and we could talk about this for hours. I'm going to thank everybody that sent in questions. There are so many. We could do another whole hour on that. I hope we don't have to revisit this sincerely. But thanks to all the panelists today, Aglaya, Alex, Oksana, and Stefan. Thank you so much. Thanks to you all for joining us, and thanks to my colleagues Mike Hurd and Alice Mason who've done all the work to set this up. Please follow our coverage on www.theconversation.com. Thanks very much and goodbye.